we're all set. So,
Great.
Very good. Welcome, everyone. First, I want to offer a very warm thank you from Nikki Clements and me to all of our presenters and for the audience for joining us. Nikki, and I'm sure the rest of the audience are very much looking forward to the presenters' observations and analyses and critique. And I have no doubt that by the end of the conference, we will have a veritable full pot of gold. I should also add that the conference is being recorded and thus archived and will be available post-event, yes, for public visiting. Second, a most hearty thanks from me to Nikki Clements for inviting me to co-host this series, and that I'm serving as a co-host should not be confused with my having done anything but lifted a very feeble and occasional finger in putting together intellectually or organizationally the conference. Nikki is definitely the chef of this preuve. And has worked very, very tirelessly to bring everything into light, and worked all the more arduously and probably unpleasantly, Nikki, given our latest year of the plague and what it has imposed. So what broadly occasions this conference is not an urge toward hagiography. I would like to underscore in advance and repeatedly, but most broadly instead, Foucault's forays into early Christianity and what they might continue to yield analytically, politically, and ethically to our imaginations, where they also might have been excessively idiosyncratic. As we all know, Foucault in his later readings of the work from antiquity, Greek and Roman antiquity, but later as well, are deeply marked in some cases by a highly idiosyncratic mind at work. But we also want to attend to where his engagements with Christianity might have gone wrong, might have gone awry. And all of this will be combined together in a conference that we hope will be both exemplary in showing us how we might use Foucault, continue to use Foucault's work in the future, but also to engage him critically, not in a sympathetic sense, but not necessarily an embracing sense in what he has left us. And this, of course, doesn't merely include the work in his latest years, but still his work as a whole. More particularly, the conference is occasioned by the publication in French recently, and much more recently, of Les Aveux de la chair, Confessions of the French, Confessions of the Flesh is what I meant, which is the fourth volume of the History of Sexuality. That text is a very sustained treatment of the early Christian anthropology of sexual desire, the theological anxieties that were brought to it, and the emergence and the institutionalization of the monasticism that sought to liberate the soul from its corrupting influence. We have snippets of the fourth volume published before Foucault's death, but the volume itself, of course, has only recently come into published light. Like most engagements with Foucault, this conference comes with controversy. The first concerns the publication of the fourth volume. It's well known that Foucault told his partner, Daniel Defer, that please he not do to him what Max Brod did to Franz Kafka, namely publish works of Kafka's, including, as we now know, many, many diaries that had not been published by the time he died. Brod didn't obey, and the Foucault estate has not exactly been assiduous in following that request either. Many of the works that have been published, such as the lectures, the estate decided were already effectively public, and as a consequence, merited publication, particularly because the estate was concerned that they would otherwise be published in pirate fashion. This is also true of the publication of Foucault's Des Mineurs thesis, his long introduction to Kant's anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. This volume is perhaps in its publication even more controversially published than much of what has come to light posthumously, because it definitely was not finished. And that is responsibly recorded in the French and English publications with ellipses and footnotes and so on, which I have been very happy to see. But nevertheless, I think goes beyond what Foucault would have wished. So our engagement with the volume, I think, needs always to be an engagement that is aware that Foucault did not consider the volume finished. He was an obsessive reviser of his texts, including interviews and short essays, and that it had not been revised to his satisfaction before his death must always be kept in mind. The second controversy, which has recently erupted, concerns accusations that Foucault had sex with what the accuser calls jeunes enfants, small children, young children, during his sojourns in the 1960s in Morocco. The accuser himself has since admitted he had no evidence to substantiate some such claims, and investigations by other scholars familiar with Foucault have confirmed that these are not merely without substance, but are subject to a great deal of counter evidence that anything of the sort took place. The controversy can't quite die there, because it is true that Foucault signed a document protesting a proposition that 13-year-olds could not consent to sexual activity with another. Should be underscored that this document is more than 40 years old, and that it was signed by 66 other Lumières in France, including Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So it can hardly be regarded as a fringe document. Nevertheless, it does confront us with a kind of advocacy that we increasingly would regard as beyond the pale. Not that Foucault has never been regarded as advocating practices beyond the pale before. But I would like to conclude my welcome by quoting what Nikki has very eloquently written in response to this latter controversy, namely, and again quoting, "Time and place always shape our judgments, and Foucault's uncompromising critique of any universal standard against which to evaluate who we are or should be remains a corrective to our desire for comforting conclusions." So we can also follow Foucault's lead in asking of his practices as of our own, whether and to what extent in any given situation might be done to increase our capacities without simultaneously increasing oppression. I would very much now invite us all to begin, and we'll turn the floor over to Nikki, who will introduce our inaugural speaker, James Bernauer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fabian. So my name is Nikki Kusumi Clements. I'm a professor of religion at Rice University, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome not only our esteemed speaker, James Bernauer, and my co-host, James Fabian, but so many of you wonderful intellectuals, cultural producers, readers, writers, and professors from around the country and around the world. I want to take a second and thank the Humanities Research Center for their generous support that has made this event possible, as well as my home department of religion, where the assistance of our chair, Elias Bangba, Diana Hurd, Marcy Newton, and others have been extremely supportive in this event. I should note very briefly that this series was conceived as an in-person conference for last April. Clearly, that didn't happen for reasons that are too evident right now. But I think that the occasion that we now have to make this into a virtual series where our wonderful international speakers might be able to not only engage each other, but that we all might participate in this larger conversation, both today and through the records, makes this an action of equity. And it really puts into practice the kinds of values that we ourselves aspire towards in the spirit of Foucault himself. I would also like to flag the other panelists who will be in conversation, not only at the hour today, but then also throughout the next 5 weeks. In more or less alphabetical order, we have today James Bernauer, Thursday Peter Brown, next Tuesday Philippe Chevalier, and Mark Jordan. After that, Lynn Huffer, Elizabeth Clark, Ariana Scarzini, Daniele Lorenzini, Martina Tazioli, and Achille Membe. So it's really a phenomenal cast from so many different disciplines. And it's really a testament to the work of Foucault that it requires people from so many different domains of thought and inquiry that Foucault himself helped shape over the last 40 years. And that we might today not only put into context this particular work, Les Aveux de la chair, and the controversy surrounding it as an unfinished document, but also take up the spirit within which Foucault was writing. A spirit of resistance, a spirit of not just counter-conduct, but of true ethical formation. How do we shape ourselves and help reshape societies in turn? How do we subject the norms around us to the critical gaze, which means that we resist the comforting conclusions of the known and instead work towards the ability to think differently. So with that in mind, I am thrilled to introduce today Professor James Bernauer, who is the Kraft Family Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Boston College. He's the author of Michel Foucault's Force of Flight Towards an Ethics of Thought, which was, I believe, his dissertation that he wrote in part under the tutelage of Foucault in the 1980s that we will hear a bit of today. Not an official director, but certainly a direct influence. He also recently published Jesuit Kaddish, Jesuits, Jews, and Holocaust Remembrance, which is an exceptionally brave and challenging work that I invite you all to engage. People might know him best through the work, The Final Foucault, which he co-edited with David Rasmussen. And this has become the standard for not only putting The Final Foucault into context through this last interview in January 1984, but also the broader themes of spirituality, ethics, resistance, and what we can actually think about in terms of Foucault's strange turn, not only to Christianity, but also to antiquity more broadly. So with that, I will thank James Bernauer and simply flag that as the director for the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College, he also brings the depth of political insight, and I'm really looking forward to the ways in which the intersection between political spirituality and ethics as a form of resistance might be illuminated today. So thank you all so much. And Professor Bernauer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikki. Fellow Foucault readers, welcome. Thank you for coming into our session. And I'm speaking from Boston, which has a bit of a rainstorm right now, but it's driven away some of the construction that was being done around here. So we have a more quiet and tranquil atmosphere to think about Foucault's work. I want to thank especially Nikki and James and Rice University for imagining this conference and then finding a way to turn it into a series of lectures. I look forward to hearing from the other members of the lecture series. Much in the presentation that I'll make today reflect parts of my essay in the current issue of Foucault Studies, which is an open access journal, and it has a special issue that was published last month on Foucault's Confessions of the Flesh. Still, there are some introductory comments that I would like to share with you as an orientation to that essay, if one wants to see the sources that I'm referring to, and as the context for Foucault's volume itself. When I was informed of the distinguished group of scholars who would be in the series, I wondered about what contribution I could make to this series. I'm far from learned in early Christian studies, while fortunately we have very eminent scholars in that area among our speakers. And I'm also not an historian, but as I thought about it, there was one strength which is mine. I was a student in Paris from 1978 to 1980. And these were particularly rich years in Foucault's intellectual and political development. And I put the two together because I think the political and the intellectual have to be kept together for Foucault, certainly at this stage. And that goes for the Confessions of the Flesh as well, which I hope to indicate. Their spiritual dimensions are particularly interesting from this period for Foucault himself and for what he wrote. It was in 1978 that he made a second trip to Japan and had discussions on Buddhist mysticism and the differences it had with Christian mysticism. While there, he visited a monastery and practiced Zen exercises. And in conversation with the Zen master at the time, he confessed that what most interested him about his practices were that new relations between body and spirit were generated. In September of 1978, he travels to Iran and witnesses the revolution, elements of which he finds a striking expression for: spiritualité politique, a political spirituality. He had already written about the ongoing struggle with fascism and references a text at the same time from St. Francis de Sales in describing a study as an introduction to the non-fascist life. A month later, October 1978, it was a busy year. A month later, John Paul II is elected Pope, for whom Foucault had a certain fascination. And after the Pope helped to give birth to the labor movement Solidarity in Poland, Foucault became a major supporter of it. In these years, he also intervened in a variety of human rights campaigns, not surprisingly, for those who know Foucault, on behalf of the boat people fleeing Vietnam, against the executions that came to take place in Iran, and also for the protection of Polish universities and their freedom. And in 1979, he studies the Church Fathers, who become a major focus in his 1980 course at the Collège de France. Now, in addition to this brief sketch of some of the roots of the political spirituality that he developed at this time, I'd like to emphasize two other features. First is conflict, and the second is ignorance. Conflict. Let's begin with the very cover of the English translation, which I presume can be seen. And it's rosary beads that wrap around the volume's front and back, actually, the crosses in the back. It's an unusual design, and it's done by a very distinguished designer who apparently doesn't do covers anymore. At first, the design struck me as whimsical, but the thought did cross my mind that it would be terribly misleading for some pious believer to pick up Confessions of the Flesh, thinking that he or she would learn something about the Rosary, which is one of the most traditional of Catholic pious practices. I don't know the intention of the designer. I was tempted to contact him, but then I saw something about he never gives narratives to his designs. I don't know if that's the case, but but as I thought more about this strange cover, it struck me perhaps as more to the point than I initially thought. That traditionally the Rosary has been thought of as the Dominican order's response to the Albigensian heresy in the 12th century France. And this was a fierce conflict over that heresy's dualism of a good spiritual world, or the world of soul, and an evil material world, the world of body. So this was contrary to Catholic belief in the unity of creation as good. And that creation included the goodness of flesh, a belief affirmed in the Hail Mary prayer that constitutes the Rosary, and that in its complete form is recited 150 times in imitation of the Bible's 150 Psalms. If you ever got that as a penance when you made a confession to a priest, it was a very bad sign of what you were doing in life. I don't think they ever went back to confession again. But in any case, it's against this heresy, this dualistic heresy. My point is that the cover and Foucault's investigation does suggest the spiritual character of the conflict within the many texts the volume studies. I think there's perhaps an underestimation of the conflict that lurks in this volume. The writings of the Church Fathers are in a spirit of combat with the sordid heresies that are primarily denying the real coming into flesh of God, that are rejecting the humanity of Jesus, claiming that the divine person just appears to be in the flesh. The Fathers' focus on spirituality doesn't exclude the contribution that they made to the doctrinal formulations of the Council of Nicaea in 325, where Jesus was affirmed as divine. Now, whether he intended this or not, Foucault's text wades into one of the most profound questions our civilization has ever raised. How are the divine and the human interrelated? How godly are we as human beings? And what does it mean to be made in the image of God? This combat between spirit and flesh, I'm going to change that notion in a moment. This combat seems important to recognize because we are largely ignorant of the spiritual continents Foucault was exploring and that he himself occasionally became lost in. For example, he skirts the conflict between flesh as the fruit of divine incarnation and flesh as sinfully subversive of our likeness to God. These are the two experiences of flesh that operate in Christianity. A subversive flesh, that is the penalty of the fall of Adam and Eve, and an incarnational flesh, that is God's gift in Jesus. And the words of the ancient hymn chanted at Easter transforms the fall into, quote, the truly necessary sin of Adam, the happy fault, felix culpa, that earned so great a redeemer, end of quotation. His very last lecture at the Collège de France, March 28, 1984, indicates Foucault's appreciation for the difference between the two paths of Christianity's development. A periastic Paul, the activity of courageous revelation that grounds its mystical tradition, confessing an eternal love, all right, and an anti-periastic Paul that founds its ascetic tradition and operates penitentially through the activity of, that founds the ascetic tradition and operates penitentially through a fearful obedience to God as lawgiver. Commentators on Christianity give far more attention to the latter than to the former. All right. Let me say something more about our shared ignorance. A vivid recollection for me, which I've mentioned many times in lectures, always gets a good laugh. A vivid recollection for me is from the 1980 lectures, the Collège de France, which I attended, and where at one point Foucault introduced the writings of the 4th century monk, John Cassian. The lecture hall soon filled with bewilderment and the murmur of a common question: Cassian, qui est? Cassian, who is that? This was particularly amusing to me because as a novice in the Jesuit order, I had to suffer reading large excerpts from Cassian's conferences. And I found it astonishing that the avant-garde Foucault, whom I came into Paris to learn from, was echoing the interests of my pious novice master. In fact, I thought there must be some other Cassian to whom Foucault was making reference. Although we may be familiar now with the name Cassian, thanks to such works as Professor Clement's new book, the bewilderment of that 1980 audience may still be beneficial for us to share. Many of us who are dedicated readers of Foucault are also very much novices on the spiritual paths he is exploring in the Confessions of the Flesh. And perhaps we are far too eager to locate its insights within his earlier concerns with institutionalized confessional technologies and the road to modern sexuality. There is a more striking example of the limits to our knowledge, at least in the English-speaking world, of the figures that Foucault is dealing with in this volume. Perhaps the single most prominent encyclopedic volume published in English that treats Michel Foucault was released at the end of 2014 by Cambridge University Press as the Cambridge Foucault Lexicon. And it's an excellent volume. It's almost 800 pages, contain 91 articles by 72 authors from many different academic faculties. Among the themes treated, there are only 4 brief entries that directly touch theological issues: Christianity, confession, religion, and spirituality. I'm the author of the first 3, and Professor Edward Magushin of Stonehill College composed the last. Despite the wide range of themes examined in the lexicon, there is no reference to such important topics as the pastorate or pastoral theology in general. Its index has no mention of virginity or even flesh. Of the 25 thinkers who have essays dedicated to them in the volume, not a single figure who appears in Confessions of the Flesh is included. It may be understandable that Foucault's concern with some lesser known Christian writers might not have been appreciated. One thinks, this is probably really, I shouldn't say with scholars of early Christianity around, but even some lesser known ones as Clement of Alexandria, Cyprian, Gregory of Nyssa, and so forth. I guess for many, those are not minor figures. But the Cambridge Lexicon has no article even on Augustine or Cassian, who had been important in Foucault's work for many years. And these omissions, despite the fact that over the years, before and after his death, there have been many publications in English, either by Foucault himself or by others, on his relation to religion and spirituality and to Christianity in particular. Now, the reason I emphasize this ignorance is I really do believe that Foucault did not find the audience he was looking for in 1980, and that his lectures were hoping to ground. I think we're too distant, and this might be even more true in France and the United States, where we seem to have a public recognition of religion, but maybe not of a scholarly recognition. But I don't think in France there was this capacity at the time to enter into conversation about religious matters and with these authors. And that's why he asked me, as an American graduate student who fumbled in French, he asked me if he could set up if I would set up an informal meeting with some theologians so he could talk about his work. And I thought, a professor at the Collège de France is asking me. And so I did do such a thing, and it was a very memorable meeting for me, certainly. I don't know what Foucault derived from it. But the neglect of this volume is also striking in its omission of explicitly Catholic themes. And that omission is a standard practice in commentary on Foucault. Although there has been a growing appreciation of Foucault's interest in such practices as confession and such religious figures as Cassion, this general recognition of interest has rarely reached the sophisticated level of grasping the specific Catholic dimension in Foucault's examinations, except as a development from earlier Greek and Roman cultures. This neglect would be a significant liability in detecting unique accents in his treatment of eroticism in Confessions of the Flesh. While sexual matters came to be developed at greater length in the 4 volumes of the History of Sexuality, they emerged with perhaps even more arresting force in some of his early writings on literature. This is how he opened his 1963 essay on George Bataille. Quote, "We like to believe that sexuality has regained in contemporary experience its full truth as a process of nature, truth which has long been lingering in the shadows and hiding under various disguises, until now, that is, when our positive awareness allows us to decipher it so that it may at last emerge in the clear light of language. Yet never," and this is Foucault, "never did sexuality enjoy a more immediate, natural understanding, and never did it know a greater felicity of expression than in the Christian world of fallen bodies and of sin." End of quotation. But it's not just the world of fallen bodies and sin, as he continues in the essay, because that world is not separable from traditions of mysticism and spirituality. And it is there that the complex set of negotiations with oneself making up Christian experience, quote, "lead without interruption or limit right to the heart of a divine love of which they were both the outpouring and the source of returning upon itself." End of quotation. In this network of erotic events, we touch enduring Catholic encounters with flesh. It's almost never been noted that Foucault's literary interlocutors in that early period had, as he himself did, a traditional Catholic formation. All right. Bataille, Pierre Klosowski, and Maurice Blanchot were all Catholics. And the first two actually spent time exploring religious vocations, which I owe to Philippe Chevalier's fine volume on Foucault and Christianity. Does the cover of volume 4's English translation genuflect to this Catholic dimension by its drawing of rosary beads? I don't know, but I like to think it might. Still, there may be a possible bewilderment in reaction to the fact that such Catholic themes as virginity occupy 100 pages of Confessions of the Flesh. But it's important to recognize that for Foucault, virginity is sexually significant and confirms his religious sources. And we should not be surprised by that, because as Peter Brown has pointed out, if I can quote from the master who will be here on Thursday, this is to quote Peter Brown, "From an early period in some sectors and universally, after around 300 of the Common Era, the ideal of virginity, practiced equally by men and women, enjoyed a moral and cultural supremacy in the Christian church that remained unchallenged until the Reformation." End of quote. Isn't an understanding of virginity and the modern reduction of it to mere physical intactness essential to what later came to be designated sex, and that category's facile association with repression? Here's my hypothesis. It is crucial to appreciate that the inquiries of volume 4 emerged from the work of what was to be volume 2 in the original plan of the History of Sexuality. That volume was to be called Flesh and Body. My view is that Foucault initially thought that he would be able to draw this distinction with relative ease, a differentiation between the pre-modern Christian culpabilization of the body as flesh versus spirit, all right, what he called the moral physiology of the flesh, on the one hand, and the modern materialistic approach to the sexual body on the other. If these were clearly differentiated, the road would be open to the researchers of his original 6-volume project, The Children's Crusade, Woman, Mother, and Hysteric Perverts, and Populations and Races. What happened to this original project? Well, there are so many responses to that question, depending upon the responder. Did the theme of virginity in the thinking of the early fathers and its concomitant experience of the flesh generate a more complex field than Foucault had expected? Did virginity find itself enfleshed in a mystical, ecstatic elevation as rich as any threat of subversion of the spirit? This realization would certainly have created fresh complexity for Foucault and his original plan. I believe it did. In general contemporary discussion, virginity is most often associated with loss in descriptions such as one loses one's virginity or one forfeits one's innocence. With women, we hear of a deflowering and the taking of or stealing of virginity. With men is most often different, the loss of a childhood innocence that is regarded as a door into maturity. These are certainly numerous current perceptions. There are certainly numerous current perceptions of how virginity is in fact lost, and loss does seem to provide the basic context for how virginity is approached. And this is even the case when discussing certain cultures that regard virginity as a valuable commodity that may be exchanged for other goods. The cultures of the church fathers certainly grasp this reality of loss because it opens out to the post-virginal rebellious state of a flesh that is dominated by a struggle with spirit. The seditious flesh invites both the development of disciplines which manage the flesh, as well as the creation of systems of discernment, which interpret the struggles between angelic and demonic movements within individual souls. These discernments of consolations and desolations cry out for the wisdom of an interpreter, to whom obedience is rightfully owed. This is a very familiar story in Discourse on Foucault. Technologically, this is the achievement of the practices fashioned by Cashin. Theologically, this is the complementary system of Augustine. This is the story that Foucault's interlocutors often encouraged him to develop and augment. And this is what he largely did. And my expectation is that many commentators in this volume will focus with variations on the story of spirit versus flesh, a story that is a familiar path into kindred categories of sexual activity, disciplines of sexual repression, as well as the foreshadowings of modern sexuality and the will to truth and knowledge about it. But that approach, as tempting as it would be for contemporary commentators, may not exhaust the complexity of what Foucault studied in this volume, namely the interaction of incarnate flesh and seditious flesh. Pagan and Christian ascetical traditions are separated by a wall, often breached from the mystical Christian tradition of virginity. This mythical tradition guards in an ineffable way the pre-fall kingdom of life, which was once intended for all men and women, and which was inaugurated again in even more splendid fashion in God's second great moment of creation, the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh. This cosmic incarnation, this return to the pre-fall possibility, is concretized in the waters of baptism and in the art of virginal existence. As Foucault writes, within this is a conception of the very history of the world. And how does virginity celebrate the flesh? By the refusal of death, by removing oneself from that struggle between life and death that concluded volume 1 in his history. Death was far more menacing to that patristic age than sexual lust. And Foucault cites Gregory Nissa's joyful acclamation of death's defeat by virginity. Virginity escapes regular comprehension because it overcomes nature and history and all law and dwells in eternity. The state of virginity is not lost through physical actions, but through an ignorance that starves the soul. Inspired by God and God's love, the virgin man and the virgin woman are new creations. How may this new creation, this glorified flesh, be understood? Certainly not through the categories of sexual asceticism or renunciation. Virgins are not masters and mistresses of renunciation, but rather witnesses of the spiritual marriage that unites them with the God who is both fully human and fully divine. The witness is also to one's personal unity of body and soul. The sin that needs to be confessed, as has been claimed for Augustine, is not the pains of human embodiment as such, but rather the fracturing of the human person into conflicts of body and soul, spirit and flesh. And as Foucault points out, this participation leads them to an incarnate art of living that embraces the most seditious, the most refined pagan aesthetics. This is the example he gives of Clement of Alexandria, who traces this culture of the self not from the pagan philosophers with whom Clement was very familiar, but from the inspired biblical authors. In other words, what I'm claiming is there's far too ready a tendency to link this early Christian period and their thinkers with the pagan Romans and Greeks. And that's a big, that I think distorts the reading of Confessions of the Flesh. There's not that easy transition. And Clement affirms there's nothing meritorious about abstinence from marriage unless it arises from the love of God. And virginity itself may be reclaimed. That's why we're in a different universe here than the normal approach we take to virginity. Virginity may be reclaimed after marriage in Christian discipleship. So what's happened to eclipse for many the mystical art of virginity by physical acts of sex? Is it but another example of the simplification of erotic life, which mirrors that displacement of rigorous spiritual discernment by the establishment of rote confessional practices and eventual universal mandates that Foucault examined in Volume 1? Does Christian faith in an incarnate God demand a more robust and nuanced grasp of flesh than contemporary secular understanding sexual understanding makes available for both Christians and non-Christians? Will that belief solicit what Foucault imagined in his 1978 course, a counterconduct and anti-pastoral struggle? This struggle is novel. Foucault said that while there have been anti-feudal revolutions, there's never been an anti-pastoral revolution. In today's Christianity, however, some do claim that there is a pastoral schism regarding sexual matters. But the Middle Ages produced not only types of pastoral power, but also a theological repertoire of counterconducts, all of which tend to redistribute, reverse, nullify, or totally discredit pastoral power in the systems of salvation, obedience, and truth. Confessions of the Flesh is in alliance with this novel anti-pastoral struggle in two striking ways. The first was still inchoate for Foucault, insight that religious affirmation might proclaim a robust incarnational activity rather than display any slavish dependence upon a weakened subversive presence. At the same time that he was immersing himself in religious texts, he was also witnessing the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 and becoming more explicit about a political spirituality. In an interview about his impressions of that, Foucault recalled the frequency with which Karl Marx's remark on religion as the opium of the people is cited, but then points to the previous sentence of Marx, who states that religion is the spirit of a world without spirit. Let's say, this is quoting Foucault, let's say then that Islam in that year of 1978 was not the opium of the people precisely because it was the spirit of a world without spirit. And then I'm going to curtail my presentation. I speak about some of the involvement of John Paul II in the undermining of communism that Foucault is very alert to. Some of the activities in South America of various Catholic prelates against the military governments there. And Foucault, of course, had been in Brazil for one of the most spectacular of those displays. But this is in my essay, so I feel I can skip that. I also have developed quite a bit of work on how sexuality and the limitation of sexuality to subversive flesh was used by fascists, both in Italy and in Nazi Germany. And so this book does have political relevance if it's understood within a broader context. And so I'm going to skip the fascism issue. As you know, Foucault wrote about that, and one scholar said he should be the patron saint of fascism studies. I noticed a number of people always saying that Foucault should be a saint. I don't know what to make of that, but our desperate need for saints and sanctity. So I'm going to conclude with a remark by, yes, Peter Brown, to whom we're all indebted. Peter Brown made a remark he made. He wrote that such notions as virgin life have come to carry with them icy overtones for us, and even today they still crowd in upon us as fail, forbidding presences. When historical study gives them, he continues, their due measure of warm red blood, the chill shades may speak to us again, and perhaps more gently than we had thought they might, in the strange tongue of a long-lost Christianity. As the prejudice that identifies Catholic Christianity as intrinsically tied to the repression of the erotic and sexual spheres, blinded us to the celebration of the flesh. And certainly the state of blindness to incarnational reality includes Catholics themselves, no less than other Christians, as well as disciples of other faiths or of no faith. Few have demonstrated the fact of that blindness and challenged it as graphically as did the art historian Leo Steinberg in his very fine book, The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and Modern Oblivion, which I don't have to go into at this point. So thank you very much. I think I've exceeded, well, I've tried to stay within the bounds of the time allotted to me. But now I'd like, comments or questions that you might have. But I do recommend if this approach interests you, the essay in Foucault Studies will give you a better understanding of what I try to communicate verbally here.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that people are applauding from afar and so near. Would anybody who are the co-panelists like to respond? I believe I can actually make you live if you would elect to. So I'll start with Peter Brown, since he is visible to me here. And perhaps Jim, Fabian, if you would also like to note anything. I'll just say up front that the attention to virginity as an art of life is so resonant with, as you were describing, the March 28th, 1984 final lecture that Foucault gives at the Collège de France, and the poignancy of how he says, maybe next year, right, I will try to talk about this a little, right? Maybe I will talk about the history of the arts of living, right? The arts of virginity in the history of Christianity. And that really does suggest not only how unfinished Les Aveux de la Chair is as a work, but also how unfinished Foucault's own grappling was in terms of this history and legacy of Christianity at the intersection of so many forms of modern subjectivity. So I thank you for these beautiful reflections. So if anyone else would like to bring in questions at this stage, please feel free to populate the Q&A and we will take questions from there. So we have one that is coming in from Don Beggs, requesting that you speak to the differences and overlaps between virginity and the non-binary, perhaps, for example, Joan of Arc. Because in this is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that would require some more thinking than I've done about the relationship to the non-binary. But it's an appropriate question. I just haven't thought about that whole dimension of those such as Joan of Arc, who is regarded as a virgin warrior, as I recall. I've never really studied her, although I noticed every year in Paris there was a celebration at a statue of Joan of Arc, and I thought that was something. They have a good historical memory, the French. But I'm sorry, I really wouldn't be able to say anything with any clarity about it. But thank you for the question anyway.
Nikki, am I muted or not?
You're live.
Okay, very good. First and foremost, thank you ever so much for recalling to us the literary work, because I think it's been forgotten, particularly in a period of significant historical turn in literary studies, for which Foucault and his preoccupation with the relationship between madness and the meaning of an oeuvre, his preoccupation with the double in Klasowski, his preoccupation with the potential escape from the prison of the subject in language in Bataille and Breton and others, Blanchot, certainly, I think have been increasingly neglected. And you're putting them back in the context of an engagement with, indeed, scholars. Bataille, I know the best as a member of the Collège Sacré, the movement that flowed out of Durkheim's elementary forms of the religious life, took the direction towards the preoccupation with the relationship between the religious and the ecstatic. Indeed casts a very, very important light, and thank you again for offering that light on the complexity of Foucault's engagements with the Christian thenceforth. And this isn't a question at all, nor even a comment, but just an expression of thanks for reminding us of the depth of Foucault's engagement with the echoes of the Catholic tradition, or the struggle with the Catholic tradition and its mutual possibilities. Of course, Durkheim was an atheistic cultural Jew, so that's another part to fold into the story of someone like Bataille and his colleagues. But again, I've experienced in my engagement with people who read Foucault more recently that they don't read the work on literature, and I think that's a big mistake. And so thank you for reminding us that we better do that again.
Thanks.
In 1963 is such an interesting year too, because you brought up the Bataille quote from that year. That's also when he's talking about Dr. Lloret and the water torture incident. And it seems like he's really setting up in that year the two central questions that he'll describe later, which is, why are we compelled to tell the truth about ourselves? Which truth? So that question of how are we forced to normalize and speak clearly goes back to Cashin and exegesis and the incitement to discourse, the rendering of sexual acts into sexual speech, and how this has a deeply subversive and disciplinary function, instead of the erotic arts in virginity, in the ways in which one might think about not just speaking one's truth in the norms already known, but instead enacting in word and deed in a Parisiist register, as you're describing in relation to Paul, in that positive format, some new possibilities that I think Foucault actually takes up from these early Christians and then moves back to antiquity in order to unpack in more depth. So it's such an interesting tie between the literary in 1963, the psychoanalytic, the institutional, and then these long-term questions that resist capture for him because of how capacious his own mind and research is. So it's one more way in which the many disciplines represented, not only in this panel, but also in terms of the attendees, reflects the richness and the necessity of engaging this work. So to that end, I was wondering if we can take one of the questions from the audience, which is the question from Juan Manuel Gasca, which is, what is the link that we can establish between cynic parousia and exegesis? Don't know if we want to unpack that today, but that would be wonderful if you could.
Between parousia?
Parousia and exegesis.
Yeah. Well, some claim that the relationship is parousia was a recovery of a more open speech coming out of the Greeks. And it had a political dimension, as I recall. It had both political and personal, and that it contrasted with the confessional practices, both forms as Foucault gave them. But I don't think that's accurate, even though I think I thought the same thing. I think if you look at Foucault's later work on parousia, he doesn't make this rupture between Christianity and the Greeks. That Christian parousia is a very different type of parousia. And again, as that last lecture at the college indicates, it falls back into the mystical dimension. And there's a mystical speech here that Foucault is witnessing to, it seems to me. And so it's not a rejection of the confessional as such. I think, again, the confessional goes with subversive flesh, and the parousia, at least at some points in Foucault's development, he was unsure about this, I think, is the incarnational flesh. And in the last lecture of Foucault, it's very clear that he's speaking about the revelation of God in flesh. And again, people don't know what to make of this. And this is where I think Foucault, he had an extraordinary mind. An extraordinary mind. And I grow in my appreciation for it. If you look through, as Nikki has, the boxes of archives, the amount of work he spent on this project itself, the patristic project, it can't be reduced to some simple formulae. It's a very rich encounter with some fascinating thinkers. We think of Augustine, of course, and now perhaps we think of Cashin, but there's a whole group of these amazing minds thinking out what's the relationship of the divine to the human. And I think it's an extraordinary, it's a legacy of our civilization that should not be neglected. And Foucault, I think, witnesses to the effort to speak it again in some form.
Beautiful. It seems like then maybe the tension that he's unpacking in the last lecture is that between the institutionalization of Christianity vis-a-vis Catholicism and its more oppressive measures, which he labels the anti-Parisiist pole, versus the subversive, right? Any subversion of the established norm that oppresses and dominates instead of allowing for the flourishing and cultivating of practices against the norm.
Yeah.
So many rich things. There's a question from Harvey Goldman about the preoccupation with Paul. And this is a question that came up when I gave a talk in Chicago in 2018 by one of Margie Mitchell's students, which was, why does Foucault not talk about the pastoral epistles at all, as he's talking about pastoral power, right? Even in Les Aveux de la Chair, we have in Annex 2 has counterconduct in the pastoral, but it's really not very present throughout the work. And I don't know if either of you or maybe our panelists coming up in the next month will have an understanding.
Certainly some of them coming up in the next month would be far more knowledgeable about this than I. I have been struck, though, by Foucault's, I mean, you would think that in this volume, Paul would be a much more significant figure. But again, Paul is articulating flesh versus spirit. I mean, if you read Romans, and that's not what Foucault thinks is adequate for describing the flesh. At least this is my interpretation. So Paul gets eclipsed by other thinkers who are far less known. I mean, Paul would have been far more accessible for Foucault than the authors he's studying for this volume. And Paul, I mean, there are references to Paul. I mean, one of my regrets about the English translation is they don't have an index. And there's a partial index in the French version of names and the sources, but Paul is not a significant figure in the Confessions of the Flesh, even though for Christianity, especially negative approaches to sexuality in Christianity, they're rooted in Paul. At least that claim to be made. I'm gonna pull back in case I'm sure there are people who are far more knowledgeable about Paul than I am. But in terms of the pastoral letters, I'd have to go back and review them for myself. Romans is a big one for me, for its impact culturally.
And that is one of the few letters of Paul that Foucault does cite, at least a few times. So I'll give one more question that relates here, which is the question of in. So the work of Ilar Ramelli on early Christianity links ascetics with the Parisiastic counterconduct, what we call social justice today. Do you think there can be a similar linkage of virginity as a discipline and political engagement today? And I would invite you to expand the question of the practices of political engagement today in terms of this Parisiast mode.
It depends how virginity is interpreted. I mean, in the eyes of so many, it's just a rejection of the world. And for many, that is what it is. It's a way to avoid the world. It wasn't the notion of virginity that comes out of the period that Foucault is looking at. And I think it does have a great relevance in terms of the problem that our culture has, as was pointed out years and years ago in the 60s. You have unloving critics and uncritical lovers in our culture. And so many of the critics are without love for the people that they're trying to serve in some form or other. I mean, we see it, of course, in the United States dramatically these days in terms of the hate that's been justified on a regular basis. So virginity, in that sense of a falling into love with our human condition, our flesh as glorified, that has certainly a resonance. Historically, one of the great neglects of, I think, of a lot of history in the United States, at least, is the incredible impact of nuns in the United States. I mean, they were so far ahead of where the culture was in terms of educating women. They were the best educated of the women of that period. They were presidents of colleges, founders of hospitals. The story of nuns who were virgins, who committed themselves to that way of life, was an extraordinary story of love and dedication. And so social justice is, that didn't have to be invented recently. That's part of the ethos of many different faith communities. But it may not need. Now that's the other thing. What's changed with virginity in the current culture, and is there both a positive and a negative story to that? As you know, the number of sisters in the Catholic community has collapsed, and there are many reasons for that, perhaps, but it's certainly an extraordinary shift that probably the Catholic historians are far too close to analyze adequately.
And you've certainly treated the way in which sexuality is weaponized by fascist programs, as in Jesuit Kaddish.
The other thing, if I could just add one more thought to that question about the social justice and virginity. One of the things I've done study, and it's continuing study, of those people who risked their lives trying to save Jewish life during the Holocaust, and who have been recognized by Yad Vashem, an institution in Jerusalem, as righteous. And one of the things that's been striking to me is the story of individuals that we usually have for heroic action doesn't reflect there. They were in communities of some sort. And that's what made them successful in hiding people and rescuing people, that they had all sorts of networks. And the reason I think of that is that's part of the thing of a community, of one doesn't have to be virginal in a community, but it was one of the sources of monasticism, of course, and the work of nuns. But it's something that seems to conflict with the more general approach to how people are heroic, what enables them to be heroic. And I think their networks gave them a sense of competence. When somebody came and asked to be rescued, they had a competence that an isolated individual would not have.
So instead of thinking about the physical intactness of the individual, you're talking about networks of relation, accountability, vulnerability, and care, which is moving. Maybe we can call Foucault in your typology a critical lover.
A critical lover.
We'll give him that. And I'd like to conclude with one more question, if that's all right, which is from Anne Pellegrini, who is following up on the question of virginity and wanting to know if you can relate this to the end of History of Sexuality 1 on biopower. So if you could describe in any way that you want. I know biopower is on people's minds right now, not only because of the realities of COVID, but certainly, vaccine apart, that we have so many different ways in which biopower is present today. And I think the question might be able to put into focus how biopower fits into this fourth volume in the 80s and potentially link up to the question of practices today.
Yeah, that's a big one. One of the things I've been struck by in doing the work I do on fascism and resistance to fascism is the role that women's communities played. And there's been more work done on this in recent years than before, but it was resistance to Nazism and fascism was often thought of as a male commitment. But increasingly, we're finding that women were usually the ones who were in the first stage of people looking for rescue or who needed people who would cross lines and like from the ghetto to the wider community. And often they were women who had this commitment among themselves. Again, the same point I was making, that they had a community to resource from. They weren't intimidated as loners facing this extraordinary thing. One of the things that I was struck by in descriptions by various scholars of what happened in Poland in 1979, when John Paul II had those extraordinary meetings with the Polish people. That was the first time the Poles realized they were stronger than the state, and they could bring down communism. And that, it's a number of commentators pointed that out, that it was bringing people together in that sort of situation that they suddenly realized they weren't isolated actors. They were quite powerful. And maybe that's something in terms of biopower that should be thought of in terms of, well, some of these themes coming out of the Confessions of the Flesh.
Could I just add a speculative footnote there, and to be very formalist? In the epistemology of biopower, the great contrast is between, insofar as it concerns sexuality, the great contrast is between productivity, productive sex, and everything in contrast that is wasteful, merely a matter of consumption, and that in those terms, the virginal actually falls right in the middle as a liminal category. And as we know from students of the liminal, such as Victor Turner and those forward and backward, the liminal can occupy a position of extraordinary power and specialness, almost magical often. Saints, many of them virginal, most, are an excellent example of this. And your comparison, I think, James, with the role of the church here and its clergy in the galvanization of the illumination of human possibility is, I'm an anthropologist, so forgive me. Anthropologically speaking, I think a very fruitful and insightful point.
So much. My wonderful co-host, James Fabian. Thank you so much, James Bernauer, for this really exceptional treat, not only contextualizing Foucault in the early 80s, when you had the pleasure of not only working with him, but also convening seminars of experts that, that really set the stage for so much of the work and thought that we can see in this fourth volume in the history of sexuality. I found that your final words about the being stronger than the state really poignant now. And I wonder what the corollary practices might be today. I think that there's certainly that sense of interconnectivity that we have on display here, right? Countering intuitions about space and time, we're able to connect all over the world right now. And perhaps together we can all think about how we are not stronger than the state, but maybe stronger than late stage capitalism and its various mechanisms of power. So to the end at which we can extend care to each other, I thank you both so much. I thank all the panelists for being present, and I thank every single one of the attendees. This has been a really tremendous open to the series that we will be picking up so many of the questions that have been presented today. So I encourage and invite people to bring their questions again to future sessions as well. Thank you all, and please let us give Professor Bernauer a final applause.
Thank you so much. I look forward to the rest of the series.
It'll be excellent. Thank you so much. I will stop the recording now.
Okay.